Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
It's great to be with you.
Mr. Secretary, in response to whether the U.S. suspects Iranian involvement in the attacks on Israel, Secretary Blinken said an Iran with a nuclear weapon or the capacity to have one on very short order is an Iran that is even more likely to act with even greater impunity. Do you agree?
Well, here's what we know. We know that the Obama administration said if we didn't enter the nuclear deal, there'd be war, right? The JCPOA or war. We withdrew from the JCPOA. There was no war. Now they're sitting in Vienna, the Americans are sitting in Vienna, about to re-enter the JCPOA or something just like it, and we're at war. That is, the Iranian-backed Hamas terrorists are firing rockets into Israel even today. There are many Americans in Israel. So I would simply suggest that the Iranian terror efforts, the Iranian terror campaign is funded when the United States refuses to put real costs on the Iranian regime, and that what you see happening today, Iranian-backed terror killing Israelis, is something the United States must take seriously.
Do you consider the conflict as a serious threat to Abraham Accords?
You know, it's interesting. I think the Abraham Accords will survive. They survive because they make sense. They make sense for the people of the Emirates. They make sense for the people of Bahrain. They make sense for the people of Israel. I think these Arab countries appreciate that the destruction of Israel as their core foreign policy doesn't make any sense, and they want to benefit from diplomatic relationships and economic relationships with Israel. So I think the Abraham Accords will hold. But if you upend the relationship between the United States and Iran and make Iran your senior partner for peace and stability between the United States and the region, that's an enormous mistake, and it could pose a real challenge to continuing to build out and expand on the Abraham Accords.
But you believe it would make it more difficult for other countries to?
Sure. The pillars of getting the Abraham Accords to work were pretty straightforward. We moved our embassy to Jerusalem. We said the Golan Heights are the rightful space for the Israelis to defend their homeland. We made it clear that not every Israeli settlement was unlawful. We demonstrated a full-throated support for Israel. Second, we said Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terror. We're going to treat them as such. And so we denied them resources. We took down their foreign exchange reserves from 123 billion to 4 billion. 96% of their reserves gone. This was a regime under enormous pressure. They had cut their defense spending by a quarter. They were paying Hezbollah soldiers about half. This was an effective effort to deny Iran the capacity to conduct terror around the world. And Iran with money and wealth will conduct terror. This is the nature of the regime itself. It poses a real challenge to an Arab leader who says, I want to make peace with Israel, when Iran will launch missiles into the country if they choose to do so.
On nuclear talks, you mentioned President Biden in his speech before the joint session of Congress put Iran and North Korea in one sentence as threats to U.S. and the security of the world. Do you see both countries as equal threats?
Well, I mean, they're just different. Right? North Korea has a nuclear program, not just a weapon, but a nuclear program. They have demonstrated the capacity to put it on a missile and make it travel. Query whether they could do so in a complicated environment, but they are much further advanced. But it's a smaller nation. It's a nation of just 27 million people with a tiny economy contrasted with Iran, with a very sophisticated large population and the internal capabilities that far outstrip what North Korea could possibly pull off in terms of terror, and is indeed actively engaged in that. So the challenges are different in that the two nations are different, but make no mistake about it, any country that ends up with a nuclear weapon poses a threat. Not only the threat that they will use that weapon, but that they will proliferate their technology, either the intellectual property that underlays it or the missile technology that supports their ability to use that weapon, or that they'll actually ship a nuclear weapon someplace, someday. These are real threats. We need to confront them each in their independent space, and we need to make sure that we address them in a way that matches the threat that they pose to the American people.
But they are cooperating on nuclear issues and missile technology.
They've cooperated in the past. We've now seen China and Iran engage in complex set of behaviors, another nuclear power, right? A complex set of arrangements. They are growing the depth of that relationship as well. This is something that should concern every freedom-loving nation around the world.
Secretary Blinken is saying he wants a stronger and longer agreement.
Sign me up. Sign me up. I want a stronger agreement too. I want a longer agreement too. I want them never to have a nuclear weapon. That's not the path that the administration appears to be headed down. They appear to be going back into the same old tired, dysfunctional, failed nuclear deal. Their theory of the case that they articulate is that they're just going to go back into this, and once we lift all of our sanctions, once the United States lifts all of its sanctions, and we're back in the deal, that somehow the Iranians will come back and do stronger, longer. What does stronger, longer mean? It would mean actually impacting their terror and missile programs, all the ancillary risks that are non-nuclear. Someone needs to articulate the logic behind that. Why on earth would the Ayatollah sit down with the Americans after he's got his money in his pocket? Help me.
Do you deliberately impose sanctions on Iran for the purpose of preventing or hindering a return to compliance with the JCPOA?
No, we impose sanctions to deny the regime the capacity to put Americans at risk.
So there wasn't any legitimacy issue with sanctions that was imposed, because this question was raised that whether there were legitimate reason for some of the sanctions were imposed before.
No, these sanctions were placed on a terror regime, and they were designed to keep Europeans safe, to keep countries in the Middle East safe, to keep Americans safe. This was the purpose of the sanctions regime. And whether it was individual leaders or particular financials, particular economic sectors, they were all singularly aimed at convincing the Iranian regime that they needed to behave like a normal nation, and in the meantime to deny them the resources to inflict harm on the world.
Mr. Secretary, Iran is enriching on 63% purity. They're sitting on 3 tons of stockpile, running more advanced centrifuges, less cooperation with IAEA. Has the maximum pressure policy failed as Biden administration suggesting?
No, not at all. It was wildly successful. In fact, I remember the folks from the Biden administration, what they said, what the Obama-Biden administration said. They said, American sanctions alone won't work. Ask the Iranian oil industry if it worked. We took them from 3 million barrels a day to something under 500,000 barrels a day. No, American sanctions were completely working. Ask a Hezbollah soldier who's only getting half the money he thought he was going to get. Go ask Hamas, who didn't conduct hundreds of missile launches into Israel when the United States had President Trump and our team in charge, and we had a sanctions campaign against the Iranian regime that was actually being enforced. No, it was achieving its stated objectives. The Iranian regime was on the cusp of having to make some very difficult decisions about how to allocate the remaining few resources that it had in its own hands. And I am confident that if the maximum pressure campaign continues, that we will achieve the very objectives that I laid out back in May of 2018, the 12 things that the Americans demanded of the Iranian regime in order for us to lift those sanctions.
Mr. Secretary, you were at the Congress a few days ago about the Maximum Pressure Act. Can Congress at the moment do anything to prevent the president from lifting sanctions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. A united Congress, 400 plus members of the House and 90 plus members of the United States Senate could pass laws that would require the administration to keep sanctions in place. If the administration didn't want to, they could override that veto, and they could clearly demonstrate the United States' commitment to protecting and defending our ally Israel, to building on the Abraham Accords, and to denying this terrorist regime in Iran the capacity to inflict such harm. They absolutely have it within their power.
On June of 2019 in Switzerland, you said this about Iran: we're prepared to engage in a conversation with no preconditions. You put that 12 preconditions, but you said this on June of 2019. Why?
Yeah, these weren't preconditions. These weren't preconditions. The president said we're happy to speak with them. That was his theory of the case all along. Those were things that had to be delivered as part of that conversation. So these weren't things you must do before we will sit down and talk to you. These are things you must do as part of this conversation. What we weren't prepared to do was to lift sanctions in order to have a conversation, because once those sanctions are lifted, the Iranian regime's incentives to do anything but what they have been doing for the last 40 plus years, since 1979 now, inflicting harm upon the Middle East and the larger world, will continue.
Many people are saying that you were pursuing a regime change policy. Was that so?
No, we wanted the regime to change. That's what we laid out. We said, you can't take hostages. You can't fire missiles into Europe. You can't conduct assassination campaigns into Europe. You can't underwrite militias in Iraq. You can't underwrite the Houthis in Yemen that fire missiles into Saudi Arabia. You can't support the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas in the Gaza Strip. These were the things that we asked the Iranian regime to change. Those were our demands. It was very clearly our policy.
On hostages that you mentioned, the Biden administration kept Roger Carstens, the special envoy for hostage affairs. What did you learn about negotiating with Iranian, getting Shiwei Wang and Michael White out of Iran? What did you learn in the process of negotiating with Iranian?
Well, I don't want to comment on the particular negotiations. What we clearly came to understand was that they would have enormous demands for the return of these hostages. But if one was resolute, made clear our expectations that they be returned home, that you wouldn't have to write them a check. And we didn't. And if you write them a check, if you pay them, if you pay ransom, if you hand over money and resources, as the Obama-Biden administration did before us, they'll just take more.
Did they ask for money?
Oh, they always ask for money, of course.
On the Shiwei Wang and White?
On any hostage negotiation that I was ever part of, the other side always wanted some financial assistance from the United States, some kind of financial help.
Why couldn't you secure the release of 4 other Iranian Americans?
We kept working on it. I regret that we weren't more successful. We got back multiple dozens of hostages from around the world during our 4 years. I was happy about that. I was proud. It was just amazing for me to personally come back with 3 hostages from North Korea in the spring of 2018. But make no mistake, every single American who's held anywhere in the world is tragic, and it's something that our administration was very focused on. The fact that we didn't get those others back out of Iran saddens me greatly. I hope that this administration is successful at getting them back.
Mr. Secretary, you recently tweeted, our administration exquisite strike on Qasem Soleimani had a massive impact on Iran and the Middle East. You don't have to take my word for it. Ask Zarif, you referring to the audio leaked by Iranian foreign minister. Were you personally watching the operation from the Pentagon?
Yeah, I don't ever comment on things like that.
But there were reports that you were trying to get to this operation even back you were in CIA in 2017. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't comment on internal discussions or deliberations or where U.S. officials were or weren't at any given time. It became clear that Qasem Soleimani was personally engaged as he traveled from Beirut to Damascus and then on to Baghdad, that he was personally engaged in putting in place plans that would have killed Americans, and we stopped him.
Why was it conducted as an overt operation, not the covert one?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about decisions and how they were made. We made a good decision. He had put American lives at risk, and we made sure that he didn't kill any more Americans.
But it might change the calculation of IRGC in how they responded.
Well, we've seen how the Iranians responded during our 4 years, right? We watched. They didn't launch missiles into Israel, but they didn't begin to build out complicated pieces of their military apparatus. We denied them resources. We were very effective pushing back against Iran.
Secretary, there's a question that the administration was trying to force an Iranian escalation. Do you reject that?
I'm sorry, ask the question again. An Iranian escalation?
Iranian escalation.
Oh, goodness, no, we wanted peace. We want the Iranians to sign the Abraham Accords, right? This is a nation that has a declared policy of genocide against the Jewish people in Israel. We want peace. We want the Iranian people to live in peace. We want them to grow. We want their economy to be successful. These were the objectives of the administration's policy. No, we were working every day to de-escalate threats from Iran. I had officers who were working in an embassy in Baghdad that came under attack from Iranian-backed militias on multiple occasions. We were working to take down that risk, and we used every tool, our diplomatic tools, our military tools. We used every tool that we had to de-escalate. We wanted peace. We wanted terrorism to stop, not to escalate with the Iranians.
Do you take personal threats from Iran seriously?
I take threats from any nation that is capable of conducting an attack on the United States homeland seriously. The United States government has a responsibility to protect every American citizen. We worked diligently for 4 years to do that.
Have you received threats, direct threats from Iranians?
I don't talk about threat reporting and the like. We know this. We know the Iranian regime has made threats against America on multiple occasions. We know that Qasem Soleimani himself was responsible for the death of over 500 Americans. When the Iranians say they're going to take on an American capability somewhere in the world, we should take that seriously, and we should take actions to make sure we protect that American asset wherever it is.
On Ukrainian flight on January 10, you said, we do believe that's likely the plane was shot down by an Iranian missile. On January 11, IRGC said they had shot down the aircraft after mistaking it for a cruise missile. Do you believe it was a mistake?
I don't want to talk about that. We know the Iranians shot it down. We know they lied about it at the beginning. Maybe they just didn't have their act together. Who knows? But the Iranians have still refused to take full responsibility and to take care of the people and the family members that were connected to their downing of this commercial aircraft. A commercial aircraft flying into their main airport. They shot it down. They're responsible. This is another failure of the Iranian regime to protect and preserve life. They just don't value it.
But you know, President Trump on January 9th said somebody could have made a mistake.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. I'm not going to comment on what it was. We know this. There was a commercial airplane flying in Iranian airspace, and the Iranian air defense system shot it down. I think that's enough to know.
Can you tell us exactly when and how you were notified about this?
No, I just don't talk about things like that.
And how about who notified the Canadian and Ukrainian government?
Yeah, we put out a statement at the time about conversations that I had. I'll leave it at that.
It was a miscommunication that some people, whether it was the U.S. first who notified others or not. Can you clarify this?
I cannot.
About the nationwide protests in Iran, what was going on in your mind when you saw videos of Pouya Bakhtiari for the first time?
Yeah, we saw this multiple times. We'd seen it in 2009. That is, America had seen this in 2009, and America blinked. We didn't do what we needed to support them. Our administration never blinked in making very clear that we supported the Iranian people. And so when I saw protesters, whoever they might have been, I knew what they were up against. They were up against a bunch of thugs, the Basij, an Iranian regime that was perfectly prepared to kill its own people, to preserve its own kleptocracy. This is a dangerous people, not only for the external threats that we've been talking about in this program, but to its own people as well. It was very brave of these people to step out and to make clear they wanted their freedom, their rights, they wanted this regime to change. We were wholly supportive of them, and the United States must continue to be wholly supportive of them.
Could you have done more when the internet was shut down?
We were working hard to make sure that the Iranian people had access to as much truthful information as we could possibly get them.
But at the end of your term, there was a report that the U.S. has now the capability of providing satellite internet. Is that right?
Yeah, I just don't comment on capabilities like that.
Because Iranians were asking that, please give us the internet connection. We don't need any other help. We don't need military help. But the question is whether the U.S. has that capacity, and can Biden administration provide that, you think?
Look, we think it's really important that citizens all around the world have access to global information. We see in the United States, big tech companies trying to shut down the same kind of thing, denying truthful information, even here, even in the United States Amendment, even with the protections afforded by the First Amendment. Every citizen in the world ought to have access to global information, and we were doing our best every day to make sure that citizens all across the world had that same kind of unfettered access so they could make good decisions for themselves.
On December 2019, you said that you received 36,000 pieces of information on abuse of human rights in Iran. Do you recall what was done with those evidence?
Oh, the State Department would still have that information. It would have come in through the systems. We put out a call saying, send us your story, tell us what you're experiencing, give us whatever evidence you have that this is truthful, so that we made sure that we only put forth truthful information from the State Department. State Department would still have all of the information that we received.
On elections in Iran, back in February of 2016, when you were at the Congress, you requested for a visa to go to Iran. In your application, you said, we welcome the opportunity to be convinced that these elections will be fair and free. Do you still want to visit Iran to receive the answers to your question?
It'd be fantastic. Yeah, I would love one day to have the capacity and the ability to go visit the lovely Iranian people and to see them, to see not just in Tehran, but people in Esfahan, and people in the south and east, amazing Iranian people who, those who have come to the United States do the most glorious work here in the United States. Yeah, I'd love to have a chance to get back there, and I would, more importantly, love to see free and fair elections in Iran. I am convinced if such could take place, and we're a long ways from that. We're going to have an election here in just a handful of days. It's going to be fraudulent. It's going to be unfair. They'll have disqualified candidates. It'll be a complete joke. I would love to see a free and fair election in Iran. It would be amazing to see the leaders that would rise up and make Iran a wonderful, great nation.
Does it matter if there is a low turnout in Iranian election from the perspective of the international community or your perspective?
Anytime you have lower turnout, it means your election is less representative of the people that you're claiming to rule over.
Last question I have is on Al-Qaeda and Taliban. You recently tweeted the Defense Intelligence Agency has now publicly confirmed what I said in January. Al-Qaeda's global terror operation is headquartered in Iran with the permission of Iranian regime. Do you think it's possible that Iran is holding them to prevent an Al-Qaeda attack to Iran?
Of course. Yeah, they have multiple purposes. One purpose is to say, you can stay here. You, senior Al-Qaeda operational leaders, the most senior Al-Qaeda operational leaders. You can stay here. There's two conditions. You'll do what we tell you to do, and second, you won't conduct operations against Iranian assets or inside of Iran. I'm certain it's the case. This gives them enormous control. In exchange for that, they provide support and enable these Al-Qaeda leaders to conduct their global operations campaign.
And there was some sort of exchange between Iranian diplomats were taken hostage by Al-Qaeda in Yemen and in other countries, Pakistan and Iran exchanged.
As a historic matter, yes. Yeah. No. It's absolutely the case. It's absolutely the case that there was terror on terror activity with Al-Qaeda folks fighting against Shia Muslims around the world. That's certainly true. And for that reason, a lot of Americans say, hey, this doesn't make sense. Pompeo's got to be crazy. When he talked about this in January, you had folks on the left say, that doesn't make sense. Well, it may not make sense to you, but it's a fact, and it makes an awful lot of sense if you're the Ayatollah. To have the Al-Qaeda senior leaders operating inside of your country makes perfect sense. You're happy to put down the cudgel of Shia on Sunni antagonism in order to go after the little Satan in Israel or the big Satan in the United States. That trade-off, the enemy of my friend is my friend, holds very true if you're the Ayatollah when it comes to Al-Qaeda.
On Taliban, the Biden administration kept Ambassador Khalilzad in charge. Are they carrying on your policy of withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan?
Yeah, it makes sense. 20 years on now, billions and billions of dollars spent trying to help the Afghan people stand on their own 2 feet. I am very hopeful that they'll be able to do that. I believe in the Afghan people. I am convinced that they don't want to live in the kind of Islamic conservative society that the Taliban are proposing, and I am very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that the Afghan people will demand their rights in the same way we work to help deliver them, and that there are good things in store for the future of Afghanistan. I know that the United States has spent an awful lot of American lives and an awful lot of American treasure trying to build out that infrastructure, that capacity, not only the civil society capacity, but their capacity of the Afghan National Security Forces to protect and defend their own people. I hope that they're able to use all that we have provided to them over all these years. And it's not just the United States, it's Europeans as well. All that the world has provided them to make Afghanistan a more prosperous place.
What do you say to those who argue that if the U.S. is dealing with the Taliban, it should also deal with Iranian government? You sat with Taliban, you sat with North Korea. Right,
we were prepared. Remember President Trump, we started the interview this place. President Trump was prepared to speak with the Iranian government. It's not the talking that matters, it's the actions that follow that make a difference. You always end up, to achieve peace, you always end up dealing with some really bad guys. I met with Chairman Kim. So I'm not uncomfortable having the United States government meet with people who are not aligned with U.S. interests, to work with them to try and deliver better outcomes. We were prepared to do that with the Iranian regime. They consistently declined.
Secretary,
thank you very
so
much.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.